What? Who's there? What are you doing? Returning from our family trip earlier than scheduled, we noticed the voices of a man and a woman coming from our living room, which should have been empty. Gently opening the door, we found, to our astonishment, a man and a woman entwined on the sofa. I was frozen, shivering with a coldness that engulfed me, even as sweat poured out all over my body. Then the man called out a woman's name, and she responded with a moan of pleasure to his call. That name and that voice, it was familiar. Suppressing the urge to cover my ears, I peeked through the door gap at the couple again. Could it be my mother-in-law? Indeed it was. To my shock, the woman was my husband's mother. This is disgusting. Both my husband, with a face turned pale in astonishment, and my daughter feeling nauseous with revulsion, could hardly maintain their composure in this shockingly appalling scene. Right. For evidence, I should record a video. Taking a deep breath to calm myself, I shakily reached into my bag to grab my smartphone. However, my fingers trembled so violently that I couldn't operate it as intended, and in my confusion, I accidentally pressed a different button, causing the phone to slip from my hands and fall. Hello, Sally? I heard my father-in-law's voice from the phone on the floor. The button I had accidentally pressed. The fate of a man and woman lost to their desires was not one of ideal pleasure, but a world so tragic that everyone would turn their eyes away. If only they had realized this a bit sooner, the future for these two might have been different. My name's Sally. I am a nurse who, 20 years ago, met and married my husband, a pharmaceutical sales representative, at the hospital where I work. Thanks to my supportive husband, who was always willing to help with household chores and childcare, I was able to balance work and family life, leading a peaceful existence. My in-laws, who lived nearby, always looked out for me, living away from my own parents, and wanted me to rely on them just like my real parents, showing their concern for me since the beginning of our marriage. The Stuxirianu relationship with my in-laws was excellent, and it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that my life was smooth sailing. They were indeed my benefactors. They were understanding of our working situation, especially my mother-in-law, who was very cooperative. Just with my husband's late homecoming and my irregular working hours, it was impossible to take care of our daughter on weekdays, so my mother-in-law gladly stepped in to help. She took care of picking up and dropping off our daughter at daycare, playing with her, preparing her meals, and even taking care of her personal hygiene needs. I was taking a shower if I was late coming home, waiting for my return. I was so grateful to my mother-in-law. No amount of thanks could suffice. We had decided to cooperate as much as possible in raising our child, but our house was within walking distance of my in-laws, and we were happy to know my mother-in-law wanted to help us out in any way she could. So when something came up, we decided to leave a key to our house with her. Thus the trust between us and my in-laws continued to grow and would likely remain unbroken going forward. I had a strong feeling about this and trusted my in-laws more than anyone else. Over 10 years have passed since then, and our daughter has become a middle school student. This is your life with both parents working continues, but the need for my mother-in-law's care has significantly decreased, which probably lifted some weight off her shoulders. One day, after finishing an early shift and doing some shopping at the supermarket, I came home and ran into my mother-in-law at the entrance. "What are you doing here by yourself?" I couldn't hide my surprise at this unexpected encounter. "Oh, Sally, welcome back. You're early today. I thought you'd be home late, so I did some cleaning." Why would she clean our house? Though puzzled by her expression and actions, I was thankful for the cleaning and understood that, being a stay-at-home mom, she probably had some free time during the day. I thanked her and sent her off with a smile. However, this mysterious behavior continued. Whenever I came home early from work, my mother-in-law would be leaving the entrance. Every time, she'd say she cleaned, brought some side dishes, or folded the laundry before leaving. Gradually, I started to feel uncomfortable with her actions and couldn't happily accept what she was doing anymore. Something was off. But though I appreciated the cleaning, only the living room and bedroom were always sparkling clean. The sofa and bed sheets were impeccably made, without a wrinkle. The side dishes she brought were always in containers too large for our family of 3, and the seals were sometimes broken. I couldn't help but wonder if they were leftovers from someone else. I'm grateful for her wanting to do something for our family, but I really couldn't be comfortable with her entering our home by herself while we were away. Especially since our middle school-age daughter no longer needed her help. But I couldn't ask for the house key back after all the help we've received and the care she's provided for our daughter, so I kept quiet about my discomfort. Even though I'd occasionally run into her at the entrance, she was still very kind and considerate, so I turned a blind eye to her actions and suppressed my feelings of discomfort. As the harsh winter cold ended and the trees around us began to bloom, we received joyful news from our daughter, who came home smiling. Her hard work in balancing sports activities and studies paid off. We paid off and she was accepted into her first choice high school. We visited my in-laws to share this happiness and celebrated grandly. Honey in-laws were thrilled, and my daughter looked happy. Indeed, my mother-in-law's feelings for our daughter haven't changed since the old days. Her occasional visits to my parents' house might be because she feels lonely now that her granddaughter is growing up. I decided to think of it that way. A few days later, we planned a family trip, deciding to visit a theme park at our daughter's request. It was a celebration for her passing the exams. Originally, we thought about going after her graduation ceremony when we could take our time, but with the break increasing the number of visitors at the theme park, we figured it wouldn't be as enjoyable. Also, our daughter couldn't wait until break, so we decided to make use of the weekend we both had off for a short one-night, 2-day trip. Signed this in Paulifalt. The first day was for shopping, and the second day was to fully enjoy the theme park before heading home that night, following our daughter's wishes. We informed my in-laws of our plan, and the 3 of us set off early Saturday morning. At the shopping mall we arrived at after about 3 hours by car, I enjoyed shopping with my daughter. Of course, my husband was on bag-carrying duty. We indulged in our favorite foods at the buffet for dinner, ate lots of desserts, and laughed, saying sweets go to a separate stomach, much to my husband's amazement. My daughter said, "I'm going to be a nurse, just like Mom." This with great strength and confidence during a family moment in our hotel room. She decided on her future by watching me work as a nurse. For that reason, she chose a high school with a nursing program that could give her a qualification as a licensed nurse. Though she must have felt lonely many times as a child when I was busy with work and had to leave her with my mother-in-law, she understood her environment and our jobs, and now she's forging her own path. I'm proud of her as a parent. Her straightforward gaze reflected the limitless possibilities of her future. Thus, our trip's first day ended with smiles all around. The next morning, greeted by cloudless, sunny sky, we entered the gates of the theme park right at opening time. At the theme park she had longed to visit, our daughter was thrilled from the morning. We took photos with character plushies, screamed in delight at attractions and shows, and I enjoyed myself as if I were a child again. "Let's go on that one next." Saying so, my daughter quickly headed toward the attraction she had her eyes on. Her figure grew smaller as she walked away. Kids grow up in the blink of an eye, I thought, feeling a mix of emotions. It feels like just yesterday I was chasing after her toddling figure. I couldn't believe how much she had grown. I nodded deeply to my husband's words. Then suddenly, our daughter stumbled and fell forward. Thus we rushed over to her, and it seemed she hadn't noticed a step and had twisted her ankle. Ouch! Holding her right ankle, my daughter couldn't stand up because of the pain. My husband quickly took off her sock to check her ankle, but there was no internal bleeding or swelling, and it didn't seem like a fracture that required immediate attention. It was probably a sprain. However, walking was difficult for her due to the pain, and she needed proper treatment at a hospital. Since it wasn't an emergency, and considering the convenience for future visits, we decided to go home first and then see our family doctor, who also operates on weekends. It was a hospital we often used during our daughter's injury-prone early years. Regrettably, just a few hours after opening, we had to leave the theme park and head home. We bought some souvenirs to cheer her up, but my daughter couldn't hide her shock at the trip ending this way. "Once your foot heals, let's come back soon for a Rito," I said, making a promise, and she finally showed a smile. The roads were surprisingly clear, and we got home by mid-afternoon. As we got out of the car with our many bags, we headed towards the entrance. The door is unlocked? My husband frowned at the entrance. It couldn't be unlocked. We had double-checked everything before leaving. Could someone be targeting our house for a break-in? But in broad daylight. Then my husband quietly and slowly opened the door to avoid making any noise. It was clear someone other than our family was inside our house. Who could it be and for what purpose? And how did they get in? I was sweating profusely. My heart was pounding against my chest, and my legs were frozen in fear. You don't know who's inside, but it must be an intruder. Let's enter quietly so as not to be noticed. You two follow me? And if anything happens, run out and call the police, my husband said, leading the way as we quietly entered the house. Then from the living room, we heard noises and voices of a man and a woman. That's what Morph is going on. My heartbeat intensified even more. My daughter, gripping my hand tightly, seemed to be sweating as well. What on earth was happening behind this door? Then my husband quietly opened the door to the living room. What we saw through the gap. It was a shocking scene beyond our imagination. There was a man and woman entwined on the sofa, moving vigorously. What? What are you doing? He exclaimed in a low voice, but the two on the sofa seemed completely unaware of our presence. Frozen with fear and confusion, tears started to stream down my face. I couldn't understand the situation, but there was no denying that we had walked in on an intimate moment between two strangers. There was no denying that what was unfolding before our eyes was happening in reality.
Pulled out her name, and the woman responded with a moan of pleasure to his call.
That name and that voice, I recognized it. But Chili and Barton's, though I wanted to cover my ears to block out their voices, I gasped and looked again through the gap in the door. Could it be my mother-in-law? Indeed it was. But to my shock, the woman was my husband's mother. My husband stood frozen, his face turning pale with astonishment. What are you doing in someone else's house? I shouted as loudly as I could. However, the two were so engrossed in their own world that my voice didn't reach them. And closer inspection, I noticed their clothes scattered on the floor. What's this? I was even more shocked. Bright red underwear and a flashy dress. Given the situation, these had to belong to my mother-in-law. But my mother-in-law is turning 65 this year, wearing such flashy items. Faced with this unbelievable reality, a chill ran down my spine and I shivered. This is disgusting. Then my daughter covered her mouth with her hand. I shouldn't have let my daughter witness such a shocking scene. And my husband, unable to hide his shock, behaved suspiciously, as if his soul had left his body. Considering both their physical and emotional states, I suggested they go upstairs to rest a bit while I handle the situation here, and they slowly ascended the stairs. Peeking into the living room again, the fervor between my mother-in-law and the man had reached its climax. What should I do, I thought. Does my father-in-law know about this? I thought. Oh, he couldn't possibly. But in-laws always seemed so loving in front of us. The thought that one of them could be having an affair never crossed my mind. That's it. I'll report this to my father-in-law, I thought. But first, I need to gather evidence. Trying to calm myself down amid extreme tension and turmoil, I managed to pull out my smartphone from my bag. I attempted to record a video, but my fingers trembled so much that I couldn't operate the screen properly. I need to record this quickly. My rush only led to more confusion, and I accidentally pressed a different button. Suddenly, the display on the screen changed, and in my panic, I dropped the smartphone. It made a sound as it hit the floor. Oops, I've noticed for sure. Then, hello, Sally? But what's going on? Suddenly, I heard my father-in-law's voice. Shocked, I looked at the smartphone. My call had accidentally connected to a video call with my father-in-law. The button I had mistakenly pressed was for video calling. It's in my rush to inform him, I had accidentally called him. Hearing my father-in-law's kind voice brought back some calmness amidst my confusion, and I decided to tell him the truth. But my in-laws had such a good relationship. By revealing my mother-in-law's affair, I would be destroying the relationship between these two. Feeling sorry for my father-in-law, who would be the most shocked by this, I was torn between whether to inform him or keep silent. However, I couldn't bear the thought of my mother-in-law deceiving him and continuing this affair. I was hesitant to tell you, but what my mother-in-law is doing is definitely not healthy. I can't forgive her. I picked up the smartphone from the floor and aimed its camera at the two on the sofa. Right now, she's having an affair in our home. And so the live broadcast of my mother-in-law's affair began. As on the other end of the phone, my father-in-law was speechless, unable to hide his surprise. I felt terribly sorry thinking about how he must be feeling. The betrayal by my mother-in-law must have caused him unimaginable pain. My father-in-law's voice was lower than usual, filled with anger. Thank you for telling me. I'm heading over now, so please keep an eye on them, he said before hanging up. Anticipating a confrontation, I filmed the adulterous scene as evidence before heading back upstairs. My daughter had regained some composure, and her complexion had returned to normal. I told my husband, who was sitting next to our daughter, that my father-in-law was on his way, and we discussed supporting him through whatever storm was about to ensue. Leaving my daughter upstairs, my furious husband and I went back downstairs to check on my mother-in-law. That's that your affair had ended, and the lover, as if he owned the place, opened our fridge and started drinking a beer with a casualness that made me nauseous. Hey, you're drinking again. I've told you not to just help yourself. My mother-in-law said in a sweet tone I had never heard before. First, the ease with which her lover rummaged through our kitchen struck me as profoundly odd. That two of them, completely unaware of our presence, lounged as if they were in their own home. They never imagined that the family supposed to be enjoying the theme park would be right behind the living room door. The two of them looked like a happy couple in a scene from a drama. First, like their moment of bliss, like a scene from a drama, was about to shatter with a loud noise. Then the front door opened with a bang and my father-in-law entered. My mother-in-law and her lover were startled by the noise. They finally noticed us, and my father-in-law, showing his anger, was the first to throw open the living room door and strode towards them. Right towards the two with determined footsteps. My father-in-law, who wasn't supposed to be there along with us, the couple, saw my mother-in-law and her lover in their underwear. So surprised were they that their faces turned pale instantly. "What is this disgraceful appearance?" My father-in-law yelled at my mother-in-law, then turned his gaze towards the lover. Then my father-in-law suddenly showed a surprised expression and was left speechless. The lover was actually a direct subordinate from his company. How could you? My father-in-law couldn't hide his shock. The betrayal by his wife and subordinate must have been devastating. "Both of you sit down on the floor. Let's have a proper talk," said my husband, unable to contain his anger. After making my mother-in-law and her subordinate dress and sit down in the living room, my husband interrogated them fiercely. The two, sitting as told, looked down and kept silent. They were possibly trying to maintain their silence. But they must know they can't just walk away from this situation as if nothing happened. Don't just stay silent. Say something. My husband's anger reached its peak, and he grabbed the subordinate by the collar. At that moment, I stopped him. "He's not to blame. It's all my fault." My mother-in-law suddenly broke down in tears. Whose tears are these supposed to be? Surely my father-in-law is the one who deserves to cry the most. My father-in-law, fists clenched and shaking, glared at my mother-in-law and her lover. Then my mother-in-law slowly started to speak. However, her justification was incredibly selfish, further fueling our rage. It all started about 2 years ago when my father-in-law brought the subordinate home. As usual, my in-laws and the subordinate had a pleasant dinner together. Suddenly, my father-in-law received an urgent call from work and had to leave, leaving my mother-in-law and the subordinate alone. Overwhelmed by a sudden urge, my mother-in-law began to seduce the subordinate with sweet words. He's having a preference for younger men. My mother-in-law had started to see the frequently visiting subordinate as a man. Initially, the subordinate was hesitant and refused my mother-in-law's advances, but having had little experience with women, he couldn't contain his excitement. Just this once, they thought, and thus they indulged in pleasure on the living room sofa. After that, my mother-in-law started calling the subordinate frequently. He decided it would only happen once and refused to meet again. But my mother-in-law, making up excuses like, "Just for tease," or "I have a present for you," gradually made it a regular occurrence. Gradually, she made it impossible for him to refuse, and they began to secretly meet in cafes. Each time they met at the cafe, my mother-in-law would get close to him and lead him to a hotel, excited. That was the nature of their ongoing relationship. Disgusting. It is the only word for it. Since 2 years ago, could it possibly be? Suddenly, all of my mother-in-law's actions and the subordinate's familiarity with my home came flooding back to my mind. This is my mother-in-law, whom I'd run into at the entrance on my early shifts. Tracing back my memories, this all started about 2 years ago as well. You've been meeting here in this house, haven't you? A tree as of teens, the neatly made bed in the spotless bedroom, along with the living room sofa, were clean to perfection, not a single hair left behind. Actually, there were more pre-purchased and open side dishes than for my family. There's no doubt they were spending time in this house until just before I returned. "What do you think this house is?" I yelled at my mother-in-law, trembling. A mix of anger and despair welled up inside me, and I couldn't stop the tears. My mother-in-law just looked down and quietly apologized. And our shameless excuses continued. Initially, the two spent their secret meetings in hotels. But as their meetings became more frequent and expenses piled up, my mother-in-law sought a cheaper place. When she happened upon the keys to our house, she knew she shouldn't use her son's home but had already lost her sense of reason. She scouted our house when we were away and chose it as their meeting spot. Checking my work schedule and shifts noted on the wall calendar, all the meticulous cleaning and the pre-purchased, open-side dishes were nothing but camouflage. Realizing we were using furniture and eating leftovers from their secret meetings was utterly shocking, and I felt dizzy and nauseous. Reflecting on the past 2 years, the number of days my mother-in-law and the subordinate spent in our home is countless. My husband, pale, covered his face and sat down. "Then you promised me you wouldn't cheat again," after crying and begging for my forgiveness that time. "Was that all a lie?" But to think, at your age, with such a young man, how pathetic. As promised, it's divorce. I can't go on with you anymore. Just get out of this house. Patience, I later heard from my father-in-law that this wasn't the first time my mother-in-law had gone after younger men. There had been a similar affair in the past, which upon discovery had caused my father-in-law to explode in rage, to which my mother-in-law had tearfully apologized. They had promised never to engage in infidelity again and chose to rebuild their family. At that time, my mother-in-law had written a note stating that if such a thing happened again, they would divorce. My husband was shocked, as this was news to him. Despite this, my mother-in-law's pursuit of younger men, even after such a vow, might indeed be an illness or an addiction. However, this time, my mother-in-law showed no signs of clinging or crying at my father-in-law's words of divorce. Instead, she defiantly smiled as if she had been hoping for this. But the sudden change in my mother-in-law's demeanor brought tension to the room. "I'm serious about him. Unlike some old man, a young, dependable man is obviously better." "Fine, let's get divorced," she retorted, disrespectfully dismissing my father-in-law's age. All my respect and gratitude towards my mother-in-law, who had maintained a good relationship with us until now, crumbled after this incident. But the subordinate, too, seemed to have accepted the idea of being with my mother-in-law, who was over 30 years his senior. They clung to each other, unwilling to part. I felt all strength leave my body and suddenly sat down on the floor. This was too much to take in right after returning from our trip. Question washed over me. Then, looking at the clock, I was surprised. Over 3 hours had passed since we arrived home. Thus, the divorce between my in-laws was settled, and we agreed to discuss the details at my in-laws' house later. My father-in-law repeatedly apologized to us before leaving the house. My mother-in-law and the subordinate avoided our gaze, shamefully sneaking out of the house. Fortunately, my daughter's injury wasn't serious, and she was prescribed some ointment and painkillers, fully recovering in about a week. However, the emotional scars ran deep, and we stopped discussing my mother-in-law altogether. A few days later, we arranged a meeting to discuss everything, visiting my in-laws' house. There were the in-laws, the subordinate, my husband, and me. An uneasy atmosphere filled the living room as the five of us sat around the table. Something seemed off. On closer inspection, there was a subtle distance between my mother-in-law and the subordinate. Not only were they not making eye contact, but the subordinate was actually turning his face away from my mother-in-law. It appears there was some conflict between them after they were kicked out of my in-laws' house. It goes without saying that the affair began with my mother-in-law's skillful seduction. She spared no expense in securing her young lover, lavishing him with expensive gifts, meals, hotel stays, and even inviting him on luxurious cruises. All because money was no object, as she would often say. Believing this, the subordinate planned to elope with her, only to realize that she had no intention of leaving her husband. Realizing that he had been used, the subordinate became angry and threatened to expose their affair. But this revelation brought even more tension to the room, and my mother-in-law begged him to keep quiet. It was a messy situation, and we were all caught in the middle of it. The subordinate had planned to have my mother-in-law cover the alimony to my father-in-law and live off her as a kept man for a few years, banking his own income as savings. However, the money spent on the affair was all from my father-in-law's earnings, and when it was revealed, it turned out my mother-in-law, a housewife, was practically penniless. Upon learning this, the lover promptly broke up with her. Just rejected by her lover, my mother-in-law was trying hard to win back my father-in-law's attention for her survival. But it seems she could not shake my father-in-law's firm resolve, and the divorce seemed inevitable. Moreover, the lover was desperately apologizing to my father-in-law, because his frequent secret meetings with my mother-in-law, under the pretense of working outside, had been exposed at his company. Though he appeared to be diligently working outside, his lack of sales results had been questioned by the company, and when my father-in-law presented the evidence I had filmed, all of the subordinate misconducts were revealed. Facing the risk of being fired, the subordinate begged his boss, my father-in-law, to mediate with the company on his behalf. My father-in-law just shook his head in disapproval at the ridiculous situation as the discussion dragged on. He said, "Give it up. A promise is a promise. The divorce papers have already been submitted, and we didn't gather here today to talk about this. We're here to discuss what happens next." My father-in-law then presented a settlement document to the two. After consulting with a lawyer, we decided you two will pay this amount in alimony. Also, you'll compensate my son and his wife for the furniture they had to replace. My mother-in-law was something he couldn't possibly confess to his parents, and so, after the discussion, the subordinate left my in-law's house, shoulders slumped. He had foolishly allowed my mother-in-law to talk him into ruining his life. However, this experience might serve as a good opportunity for him to reflect on his weakness, blinded by money. As we were hurrying to leave my in-laws' house to return to our daughter waiting at home, my mother-in-law suddenly approached us. She said, "I don't have a home to go back to anymore. I broke up with him, so I have to leave his house by tomorrow. Look, I was kicked out of this house too. Could you possibly let me stay with you for a little while?" My mother-in-law, who squandered my father-in-law's money on a younger man, used our home as a hotel substitute and inflicted emotional distress on our daughter, losing everything as a consequence. For being kicked out from her lover's place and having nowhere to go doesn't mean she can just seek refuge in our home. The audacity is astonishing. Enough is enough. How can you say such a thing with a straight face? You don't even work, living off someone else's money to do such things. Just because your lover dumped you, you think you can just move into our house? Have you no shame? Don't you think you should work, atone for your sins, and try to start over? My husband rebuked her fiercely. "I'm sorry, but we cannot let you into our house. Our daughter was there with us that day and saw what you did. Since then, she finds you disgusting, feeling nauseous just by remembering." She couldn't even enter the living room for a while, shocked by the betrayal from her beloved grandmother. Do you understand how she feels? At my words, my mother-in-law's expression stiffened for the first time, covering her face with her hands. "I'm sorry. What have I done?" It seemed she was truly shocked to be seen by her granddaughter. But it's too late for regrets now. My mother-in-law will have to live with her mistake for the rest of her life. And with no one willing to lend her a hand, she walked away from us, burdened with the anxiety of an uncertain future. Despite struggling to find a job without any work experience, my mother-in-law eventually found a part-time cleaning job and managed to rent an old small apartment. But despite working tirelessly every day, her take-home pay is meager, barely covering the alimony to my father-in-law and her minimal living expenses, leaving her broke at the end of each month. At the luxury to care for her appearance, no one could imagine she once seduced younger men based on her disheveled look. Yet she still couldn't forget her relationship with the former lover, hoping to reunite with him someday. Residents spotted my mother-in-law, wandering near my father-in-law's house, perhaps missing the life they once shared. By this time, my father-in-law had no lingering feelings for my mother-in-law and was actually living peacefully in a new place, having sold the house to erase memories of my mother-in-law. Learning this, my mother-in-law stood dumbfounded in front of the closed entrance. A Peopleford stated the subordinate, too, had been ousted from his company after the truth about his skipping work to continue the affair with his boss's wife came to light. His having lost his job, the subordinate reluctantly used his savings to pay the alimony and our furniture expenses, but soon his savings ran dry. Gratuitously meeting a wealthy woman, he smirked, thinking he'd secured a comfortable life, only to be scammed by her in an investment fraud, losing all his hard-earned money. Then, enticed by the promise of quick riches and without any real evidence, he trusted her investment talks and even turned to consumer loans. He also ended up swindled, leaving him with debt and high interest. Moreover, his new job was at a highly exploitative company, where he was worked like a slave regardless of labor laws. Exhausted in body and spirit, he begged for re-employment at my father-in-law's company, exaggerating his hardships to elicit sympathy, but the world isn't so forgiving. Dismissed as reaping what he sowed, he left disheartened. My daughter adjusted to her new high school life, making many friends and actively participating in club activities, enjoying her school days. But E6 will not completely erasing the shock and disgust towards my mother-in-law. She managed to recover and move forward. My father-in-law, retired and living leisurely, surrounded by nature in the suburbs, enjoys his solitude. We visit him once a month, enjoying the break from the city's hustle and surrounded by nature. Still, my father-in-law feels guilty towards my daughter for what happened with my mother-in-law, wishing she'd forget and live happily as soon as possible. He mentions this like a mantra every time we visit. But with my father-in-law's kindness, my daughter has regained her bright smile. And when I become a nurse, I will give you a health checkup every month. Grandpa